Good evening, everyone. I am Clarice Rosa Sharif, Senior Director of Literary Programs at PEN America. It's my pleasure to welcome you to PEN Presents Maggie Nelson with Cathy Park Hong. Maggie Nelson is the author of several books of poetry and prose, including the New York Times bestseller and National Book Critics Circle award winner, The Argonauts. Cathy Park Hong is the New York Times bestselling author of Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning. Minor Feelings was a Pulitzer Prize finalist and National Book Critics Circle award winner. Links to the full bios are in the chat. So tonight's celebration is an official event of the 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival, which continues online and in person through Sunday, October 4th. If you are in New York City on Sunday, please come to our PEN America table and say hello to my colleagues from PEN America. You can find us on the map, booth number 218. I hope to see you there. I'll certainly be there. Special thanks to ProBono ASL for providing interpretation. Thank you, Zina Egbe and Sarika Mehta. PEN America's mission, for those of you who might not know us, is to unite writers and readers to celebrate creative expression and defend the liberties that make it possible. We believe in free speech and the freedom to write for all, here and around the world. Each year, we also celebrate and amplify known and lesser known literary voices through our flagship programs, including the Emerging Voices and Writing for Justice Fellowships, the Dreaming Out Loud and Worker Writers Workshop, the PEN America Literary Awards Program, the PEN Out Loud Conversation Series, and the PEN World Voices Festival, among many other programs. Next week, we will kick off the fall PEN Out Loud season with Wole Soyinka. I hope you join us. You can find out more information about the series at pen.org. But tonight, we're here for a special celebration. We celebrate Maggie Nelson and her latest book, On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint, in which she explores how we might think, experience, or talk about freedom. According to the Los Angeles Times, after reading this book, your understanding of the word freedom and of humanity itself will expand in surprising directions. I'm looking forward to this conversation. And just so you know, after the conversation, we will have a brief Q&A. Cathy Park Hong will moderate, so please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. Now, I think it's time to get started. Thank you again for joining us, and welcome Maggie Nelson and Cathy Park Hong.
Are you there?
Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay. Hi.
Hi, how's it going?
I'm good. I wish I could. This is so weird.
I know. Cathy and I are both suffering a little bit with the interface because we're not used to it. So, and we miss you all, whoever, anybody out there. We feel alone, but with each other.
Oh, I think there's less of the audience imprint. But anyway, let's just get started because I have so many questions to ask you about your wildly brilliant book on freedom. I actually remembered you having talking about it way back when. I don't know when it was, like 2016 or 2017, when it was like a packed auditorium, I think at like the Brooklyn. No, it was a Midtown Library when you were talking with Wayne Kostenbaum.
New York Public Library. They called that event like.
Yeah, it was the New York Public Library. So it's nice to see. So, you know, and it's gestated and it's turned into this wildly brilliant book, which while reading it, I found very centering, nurturing, and reparative, which a word that we talk about. And especially since freedom is a word that's never really pierced my consciousness, precisely because it's been practically trademarked by the right. But you rescue it in ways that I feel are really alive and necessary. So I guess my first question is just to kind of quickly sum up this book for people who haven't yet cracked it open. And if you haven't, you should crack it, order it and read it ASAP. So basically, you know, conservative white nationalists have co-opted the term freedom into basically a word that means to live without any responsibility, culpability, accountability, what have you. In the neoliberal system that we live in, the neoliberalism offers a quote unquote simulacrum of freedom, which basically means it satiates our immediate pleasures while yanking the welfare state and the support system that protects democracy, a la Wendy Brown, beneath us. Now, your definition of freedom hews closer to what Toni Morrison once said about freedom, which is the function of freedom is to free someone else. Freedom for you is a practice marbled in duty, discipline, and care. You also quote David Graeber, who said, freedom is, what a practice of freedom is to act as if one is already free. So that's a quote that that really stood out in my mind. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that quote and how that has informed the 4 songs in your book. And if you could also maybe ground it and provide examples from your own life and others where you see Graeber's dictum in practice.
All right. Well, before I dive into that about David Graeber and everything, I just want to say, Cathy, thanks for doing this, and thanks to Penn and Brooklyn for having us. And I'm so happy to talk to you, Cathy. And we got to talk about Cathy's book, Minor Feelings, which, as you all know, is totally genius and brilliant. I don't know when that was. It was like in pandemic time.
Yes.
I don't know, maybe last October.
Many Zooms ago. Many Zooms ago.
Anyway, I felt like, as I was just turning in this book when we were doing that, I felt all this kinship with the books. And so I've been looking forward to this for a long time. So, it was funny because I'm really glad you picked out the David Graeber, because a lot of people in talking about the book or that introduction have asked me more about Foucault and the idea of practices of freedom versus moments of liberation, which is also really interesting because of its temporal aspect, and they're related. But the Graeber actually was funny because when you brought it up, I went back and I found my book Possibilities that it comes from, and I realized how much in looking at it again, I realized how deeply this book impacted me in a lot of ways. And I found, and I actually, because I kind of forgotten where that exact passage was from. So I'll just read to the passage, which is a little bit longer around it. So he says, there is a technical term for all this, prefigurative politics. Direct action is a form of resistance, which in its structure is meant to prefigure the genuinely free society one wishes to create. Now the quote, revolutionary action is not a form of self-sacrifice, a grim dedication to doing whatever it takes to achieve a future world of freedom. It is the defiant insistence on acting as if one is already free. So what I liked about refinding the context for that was that it, reintroduced to my front of my mind this idea of prefigurative politics. And though my book is really more about like prefigurative culture, like less about politics per se, I think this idea, which obviously for him is rooted in anarchist traditions, but that is about, that the ends and the means don't differ, that you're trying to practice the behaviors and the relationships that you want to see, that there's a kind of form of training ourselves. And I think a lot of the action that when he was really writing a lot. I mean, he's always writing about lots of different things, but a lot of it had been coming right off of the Occupy stuff, which was obviously a very strong eruption of prefigurative politics. But I think now a lot of that, in my opinion, has kind of moved into prison abolition and transformative justice movements, which have the same prefigurative ideals. And I think that again, my book is like not about politics, so it's not about politics, but it's not centered in the political realm. So it's a little strange to start off talking about prefigurative politics, but I do think that the sentiment behind that is very, it saturates the whole project. And I would also say that there's that little as if part in his comment, like acting as if one is already free. And I think I always really like that because I've always, in my entire kind of intellectual life, had a very strong allergy to people diagnosing other people with false consciousness, saying like, you think you're free or you think you're X, but you're really, a tool. And I was really interested in this as if you're already free it also has a kind of, for people who are familiar with recovery language, it resonates strongly with the fake it till you make it aspect of recovery, and about how the more you fake it, the more that it becomes confusing as to what was faking it and what was making it. And I think, I don't know, there's a lot there that also, I think, permeates the book as well. Oh, and then you asked for some examples. I don't know if you want them about but I think that, I guess, you know, when I'm thinking about and this is just me, this is not like me saying what I think the best examples of acting as if you're free, but when I just think about my own life, I think like unashamed queers who are, you know, I'm thinking about, I just watched a few months ago these Voguers of Bogota. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but just put both those words into Google and watch the video, like voguing in the face of like scary, terrifying state power in Colombia, like literally in the face of the, you know, troopers. You know, like I think that kind of conviviality and risk, especially in the face of forces that are crushing, is I think I see it a lot in art, slow art, but also in performance and improvisation. You know, I think there's a lot of that. So protest art, and then I guess just for myself, you know, small personal acts of interpersonal liberation where I watch other people let go of angers or resentments or burdens that they've been carrying and find new ways. I think that, so on kind of a very large and small scale, those are some of the kind of acting as if one's free that I find moving. You know?
I find. Oh wait, there's echo. Oh, okay.
I don't hear it, but...
Okay. I just want to say I hear it a little bit on my end, but you know. Okay. So, you know, it's definitely his quote is definitely a modus operandi that I have always used as a writer, to act as if one is free, and it's something that I preach or in so many words to my students and so forth. But I wonder, it seems to, if you think it gets complicated in when you kind of weigh the options of duty, consideration, and discipline, and which leads into, when you were talking about art, this leads into my next question. You know, you start off the book writing about art, and you talk about the aesthetics of care in the art world, and you might want to kind of establish what exactly that means. But in some sense, this aesthetics of care is a corrective, like for the people who believe or practice it, seems to be a corrective against a kind of nihilistic shock art historically practiced by predominantly white male artists. And you know, in the book, when you saw, you know, when you were invited on a panel about the aesthetics of care, you said, yuck, you know. And I have to say, I kind of shared your initial aversion to this aesthetics of care, because I think to foreground care as a creator for me seems very enervating, especially since I'm already a caregiver as a parent and teacher. And, you know, I bristle at thinking of art as more effective labor. And for me, when I think of art, like I align with Alice Notley's kind of poetics of disobedience, especially when it comes from artists who have been historically conditioned to obey. You know, I'm attracted to that kind of renegade art that transgresses, and all of that. But you also, after your initial yuck, you also actually, in actuality, as you also actually seem sympathetic to it and see the need for it, not only as an artistic practice, but also the ways in which we view and absorb art. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I was curious, Cathy, with your question, and I don't want to put you on the spot. Like, where did you see? But I was curious, where did you see the sympathy happen for that? I mean, I only ask because there's kind of two aesthetics of care. I mean, there may be several that but two visitations with it in the chapter. The first is when I lay out the invitation that begins the chapter, which is, as you say, I mean, it's an open-ended invitation, and it's for an event that never happened, but the invitation said, in a year marked by divisive political rhetoric, the question of care has newly and forcefully emerged. What might an aesthetics of care look like? How do ideas of care as a form of love transform the aesthetics of protest? How does art survive? How can we care for art? How can art care for us? So there's that notion, which has a lot of things in it, but that I was kind of having a yuck response to for the reasons that you say, which were that not because I'm not pro many things that could be called care, but because of the gendered nature of the term and because of my personal and also intellectual kind of knowledge of where that word has traveled, especially in feminist circles for so many years, and the conflicts between what has been called in feminist circles between an ethics of care and an ethics of justice, and all kinds of conversations that have taken place. So to see it kind of just erupting as an unmitigated good that now was the new buzzword that we should attach to art to valence it positively seemed to me worthy of a lot of pause and query. But then when the term comes up later in the chapter, it's not really about that anymore. I begin to talk about how aesthetics requires care, and it requires care for the art, for aesthetics, and that I think it's it can be a byproduct of art that it does reparative service, and in some cases, especially in a lot of social relational art where you actually do make free dinner or other things, there are also ways in which it can occasionally in certain manifestations do direct service, but that generally speaking, I think that the attempt to fuse art with direct service is a kind of misunderstanding of both what art and direct service can do, I think that the chapter kind of tries to disassociate those two things a little bit. So that's why I was curious if you thought it was...
Maybe it was not necessarily the role of the artist that I'm talking about, but just kind of the cultural reception of art, just a societal reception of art. And maybe this is outside of what the definition of aesthetics of care is. Because when I read... aesthetics of care, not to get wonky, seems to be kind of more in line with relational aesthetics, right? Where it's where artists go outside of the gallery and try to, be embedded in culture in certain ways and documented in certain ways. But there is care. You do return to the word care, maybe not the aesthetics of care, in the way that we read art and look at art. And, here maybe we can talk about E. Cedric's term, even, when you make the difference between what you talk about reparative reading versus punitive, not punitive, paranoid. Paranoid is punitive, I guess, whereas paranoid reading is a kind where, it's anticipatory and you don't take the time and patience and to actually absorb the work, as opposed to reparative, where it involves a lot more patience and care. Does that make sense? No.
I think I'm muted. Okay. Yes, it does make sense, and I think that the question of the paranoid and the reparative is tricky, and I spend a lot of time in the chapter kind of trying to go over it, because I think that like all words, like freedom or other words, it means it's been repurposed really differently by different people who different uses of it. So in trying to kind of return it to the sense that Cedric was talking about, which is not the only sense in which the word can be used or that it matters, but I think what I find compelling and most useful about art in that is that, it's not that like a piece is or isn't reparative. It's that there's, and maybe this is what you're getting at with the action of the viewing, like there's always an interaction with the third thing, which is the art, that, and that if you're going to, I mean, as she kind of puts it, like, if you find nourishment in like an object of culture, whether it's meant for you or not, and this is the Munoz identification stuff, you're purposing it in a reparative fashion, but that's not like a thumbs up, thumbs down, like the art cares, it doesn't care. If it does repair, it does harm. Like it doesn't, it's an activity. And I think that a lot of my chapter is also trying to remind us that heterogeneity of response is one of art's great features, and that when I wrote The Art of Cruelty, which was published in 2011, and I wrote about a lot of the shock jock stuff that you're talking about, although I would add that, I did take a lot of care in that book to write about how not just white men employing aesthetics of shock, and I think that in that book, however, like as I went around with it and as I talked about it and as I, a lot of the pieces in it, some people would say, oh, that was so meaningful to me. That piece of art, it helped me through this, not my book, but like an art piece I might have talked about, it helped me through this really hard time in my life. Or, kind of like you write about, whether it's Richard Pryor or anybody else, like where you're like, this did something for me, whereas somebody else would like talk to me at a reading and be like, oh my God, I can't even believe you're talking about that piece of art. It's so noxious and horrible. And I can't even believe it was ever exhibited, and I was just kind of noted over and over again, how we bring to art all these different needs and all these different responses and all these different, and I think that is very, it's very exciting. And it's also why the artist can't really try and provide direct care, because direct care provides care for what someone you're hoping to serve, like what you, Cathy, might want or need from me. I can't do it for heterogeneous, innumerable others, some of whom haven't even been born yet. You know what I mean? And that's kind of like a fantasy of omnipotence or control that I don't think most artists have any, they have no appetite for or business with, really,
I mean, you could say that as, I want to get off the aesthetics of care, but you could say that aesthetics of care is maybe just like one approach to the many different approaches as artists use as a way to kind of address, as a kind of corrective to what's happening now. Maybe what we could talk about then is how the heterogeneity of responses have been a little bit curbed because of social media, or because of this period that we live in, because identities have been entrenched in both sides. Now, an argument, and a rightful one that's been made, is that famous artists and writers who are often targeted by the left are never actually canceled, and that their careers are just fine, which I agree with. But I think there's this more ambiguous and unquantifiable, you could say even ambient pressure of self-censorship, which you mentioned in your book. And I have encountered that among my friends and students, where they say they're not sure if they should write or make art about certain subject. And I think that inhibition is, in certain sense, quite healthy, because of the way certain male artists or white artists in the past have historically made claims about subjects that they knew nothing about. But do you think that the inhibition also kind of shifted in practices in ways that may be counterproductive? And I bring this up because, self-censorship is something that you bring up in the art chapter. And it's something that I guess I think about as both like, as a writer myself and a teacher.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I hope that the chapter makes clear that, as I kind of go through the example of Lionel Shriver or other people who, where I don't, intense and rigorous and turbulent and painful self-reflection for white artists, even if it feels stinging or hard to bear. I think that is all, I agree with you. I think that it's a healthy and salutary development that I don't think really, I don't think it, and I think that people, we're talking via the, aegis of pen, and at present, we do live in a country where people can, are not generally imprisoned for what they produce, and we should acknowledge that great privilege and not overstate it. I don't know if the word like inhibition would be the one I would use about the thing that I worry about the most, per se, because I think any artist like worth their salt is going to have to, they're going to have to do, like the Marquis de Sade writing. I'm just, teaching this week some Marquis de Sade, he's like writing it in the, in the prison and stuffing it into the walls. If you are gonna, this maybe is a bad example for a million reasons, but like if you're devoted to your whatever you want to do, I think most artists worth their salt are going to do it, whether or not there's a, cultural, whether they're afraid of getting, smack talked on Twitter or whatever it is. I'm not really worried about them either. I think the thing that I do think about a lot is just is more that I think a lot of people don't feel very good in communities that they go to where they would like to feel otherwise at present time, and that as a teacher of college students and even as like a mom, I don't quite buy that everyone's just swimming happy in the waters that we are swimming in, in the environment. And I don't think that, and I do think that habits of mind reproduce themselves. So I also think that social media, we all know this, so it barely merits saying, but it economically rewards high negativity, So the paranoid thinking is incentivized via the platforms. And I think that the habits of mind of amplifying negativity and paranoia and a kind of like looking for the rotten core of somebody's thinking or somebody's personhood and zeroing in on that spot, and then trying to amplify it in public. I do think, and if you combine that, especially during the pandemic, which is why I think there's been in part so much mental health tribulation, especially amongst young people with kind of fewer and fewer avenues for building communities which feel supportive and buoying, not just if you're ethically perfect, but when you're not, communities in which you feel as though that your friendship is more important than the capacity to toss you out. I think those lessening avenues combined with these kind of habits of mind. I do think about it a lot, and I don't think that to talk about it. I know a lot of people think that to talk about it means that you're like a political reactionary or something, and I don't think so, because I think there's this I think I have it in like a footnote, but there's this Fred Moten question where he says, why is it that it doesn't feel good to be why if I love poetry so much, does talking about poetry in this environment not feel good? And he said those are the questions like in the undercomments that he and Stefano Harney wanted to ask. And I actually think those questions are much, much harder to ask and answer than the question of like what someone's doing wrong or what we know is bad. Like those, I just think it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder in my personal life to answer. I'm very good at diagnosing what's bad and what everybody's doing wrong. And I actually find as like a critic, I started off like everybody and like a lot of my students, I started off in a very paranoid mode because I was angry. Like my undergraduate thesis was all about the pathology of Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath and how all the male critics got them all wrong and were totally fucked up and bad. It was like, and I'm good at it. You know what I mean? And so I think in some ways for me, that would be very boring criticism for me to like indulge those habits. Like I only grow it. I make more space for other things when I think what else would happen if I didn't fully indulge the hermeneutics of suspicion, where I sniffed out the rotten thing and exposed it. Like, what else would I do? Like, what is criticism for, you know? Yeah. How do we think with other people if that's not the way we're treating them? How do we cohabitate with other people when that's not the way that we're treating them? How do we make things that feel bad feel better? How do we make things that feel constricted feel more spacious? Anyway, those are the questions of interest to me, which aren't really about like inhibition or canceling. They're really about something.
Well, I mean, like I think that the hermeneutics of suspicion is a healthy place to be for a lot of young people, especially if they come from marginalized positions, because it can be very empowering, because this is something that's been inculcated in their education for so long, and it's not like they're it's this automatically jumping down the throats of these dead authors. They've been absorbed in it, and they've been soaking in it for a long time. And then it's like, okay, now I'm going to, and you write about this, it's like kind of a very kind of, in a lot of ways, very rich form of, you could say, reaction is to make work that speaks against or continues the conversation or speaks against whatever canonized art form. But I also wonder, I also sense that ugly feeling as well. And while I can diagnose it, I can't really quite say, okay, this is what we need to do. But I wonder if it also it reminds me of this quote that Greg Bordowitz said like a while ago, where he said, we have no counterculture anymore. There's no counterculture doesn't exist anymore. And like, maybe my question is, do we need counterculture? And for me, like when I was thinking about what he was saying, I mean, I think it's a lot of it is the insidiousness of social media and how it really kind of traffics our ugly negative feelings. But I think it's also just where kind of the environment that we live in, and this is like what Wendy Brown was saying, where we are all made into entrepreneurs, where we all have to be kind of entrepreneurs, whether we're poets or writers or, tailors or shoemakers or unemployed and just trying to get by and trying to kind of commodify our daily thoughts in some way or something.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to sound like so Pollyanna-ish, but like, that's not the only way,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see, so when you, in your essay about your song on sex, you contextualize the Me Too movement to the AIDS crisis in the 80s. And in your analysis of the Me Too movement in the context of the AIDS crisis, you write about how there is no, that we talk about how we have yet to have a language for women's desires, and how we only feel comfortable discussing sex under the framework of trauma and hurt, and this kind of flattening term consent. And I was wondering if you could expand on that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that I don't know if I'm kind of like, not sure if I'm seeing the Me Too movement like through the lens of the AIDS era or something like that. I think it's more like a slightly different project about like just, I mean, like what you're saying is kind of looking at like, okay, so like if you're an undergraduate or a graduate student and you read Foucault, History of Sexuality, like the first thing you're going to learn about sex is that, what we think it is produced by the discourse we use to talk about it, right? Mm-hmm. So being with my like Foucault hat on, like during the Me Too era, like I'll just kind of look at the newspapers and look at books that get sent to me in the mail or that I buy and like look at everything and kind of say like, what are we able to say or what's being said about sex now? Like, what do I hear? And I think it wasn't like I have a problem with the complaints being lodged at all, like all, necessarily so. Mm-hmm. I think it was more like, it felt like that I was wondering, what is the relationship between this discourse and being able to hear something else? Because part of the problem is that if you don't desire, then you're not guilty. And so someone else can seem wrong for desiring, but it doesn't get us out of the fact that like to desire is to risk a lot. Not, I don't mean like a disease or unwanted pregnancy, although that I mean that too, but I mean like to risk being turned down, to risk feeling humiliated, to risk, just like to risk a lot of things that are also not easy to bear, And I think that it led me to think about the way that I learned when I was coming up, like that I was hearing a very strong other discourse about desire when I was coming up. And I'll just read you this quote because it's, so I quote Amber Hollabaugh several times in this essay, and she's a self-described lesbian radical and an activist, and she formed in the 90s the Lesbian AIDS Project at the Gay Men's Health Crisis. And she has a great book I recommend to you all called My Dangerous Desires, A Queer Girl Finding Her Way Home. And this is the quote I used from her of the few, describing the kind of peak AIDS years. She says, while being made into sexual pariahs, gay men and drag queens and dykes and queer men of color and their sisters and brothers and other communities of sex and racial justice warriors spoke up and spoke out for sex, struggling to claim the right to desire, even in the face of an epidemic and a virus transmitted through sex. We refuse to be shamed or to be disowned because of our desires or because of our antibody status. This was a truly terrifying time, but through it all, although we were frequently wrong, we were also brilliant and we were brave. And I don't know, I'm sorry if I'm only moving myself, but like her quote still gives me chills like when I read it. I mean, I love so many things about it. I love we were frequently wrong, we were brilliant, and we were brave. And I think, I was taught so much by this attitude, and I don't know whether or not it's going to have things to teach people who didn't come up in it, but I know that I learned so much from like the great sexual liberationists like Carolee Schneemann, I quote, and other people who grew up in a different time I didn't live in, the 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. And I've learned so much from them about what was possible that it seemed to me worth reviving and giving a stage to people like Amber, who I don't feel like, I mean, think about the name of her book, My Dangerous Desires, right? Well, that's not, I mean, yes, those are very like 90s words, but but where are they now? And I think it's important to hear her and people like that again. And yeah.
I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's what I felt like I was missing, and that I also crave for my own life, and like the women around me. Earlier in the chapter you talk about sort of women feminists before Me Too who were kind of criticized for sort of talking about desire in a very kind of commodified way, right? They're just like, it's more about individualistic empowerment, which also seemed sort of insufficient, right? Like it's very like pink pussy hat, kind of white female, like this is my body, and as a form of sexual empowerment, which didn't quite hit the mark either, because it seemed very white feminist. But then we went from that to the pendulum to Me Too, and I think that there is this sort of, but we still haven't found that language for sexuality or in desire that is both needed as a way to talk about our desires, but also as a way to kind of not just as a way for comfort, but also as a way towards discomfort too,
This Catherine Angel quote that I use in that chapter, which I just really love, where she talks about understanding sex as not just about pleasure, but as also a means by which people move towards pain and difficulty, and I think that that's certainly true, at least in my own life, maybe not today, but like at certain times. And I think that if we can't understand those aspects about sex, then we'll be left bewildered and awash in self-judgment without understanding that it's not just like, going for, wow, that felt great. Like, that's just not what it's all about. It's about so many other things. And it's not going to, it has so much vulnerability, and it's something that you do with other people, not all the time, but some of the time. And that has so many, it's not just your desire, it's your desire as it emerges and is shaped by and in conversation with the desires of others and the desires that come out of a particular encounter. So that's all very bumpy territory.
There's a question here in the chat box. I had more questions about your drug chapter and your climate change chapter, but I could maybe kind of loop back to it. How would you say the evolving concept of freedom has impacted the way we talk to one another and communicate?
Oh, Lord. I mean, right now, having this book come out right now with the whole freedom vaccination thing, which is what everybody kind of wants to talk about, I think that it's a means of not communicating. It's what's happening right now. It's not and actually, even though I wrote this whole book before the pandemic, for the most part, it's called On Freedom, but its main, the three words, freedom, care, and constraint, are kind of like, three legs of the stool. And the book is really concerned, again, kind of vis-a-vis Wendy Brown and other people, it's really concerned with, and Cydia Hartman, really concerned with what happens if we oppose freedom and care to each other and have freedom mean unencumbered from obligation or interrelationality. Because, as I say in the introduction, that is, in my opinion, there is no such thing. There is a form of freedom that is a kind of what Kristeva via Jacqueline Rose would call the phobic core version, which is like the denial of that interrelationality and the precarity that interrelation brings. But I view that as a form of, I view like Don't Tread on Me as a form of denial of again, Don't Tread on Me is like addressing somebody, asking for something not to be done to them. It's an interrelational slogan, which belies that it's about the individual to begin with. So anyway, I think that there's a lot of, I think the word right now is just serving, as it so often has, as just like a battering ram. I don't think it's a conversation per se. And once some things become weaponized, you have to take a really long and slow unpeeling back from it and decrease the intensity and reactivity around it to talk.
I mean, this next question is kind of related to the Don't Tread on Me, but how do you think whiteness is entangled with fears of losing freedom? Do you think it's simply an implicit recognition of privileged power, or is it greater than that?
If we were in person, I could ask this person to tell me what they mean, what the it is in the second sentence. Do you think it? I don't know what that one means, so I can't answer that part. But yeah, I think whiteness is entangled with fears of losing freedom because, as I kind of describe in the beginning in the introduction to my book, I don't entirely think the shorthand. I'm not sure how many miles there are to get out of it, but I think that there are some miles for sure to get out of it, which is Ta-Nehisi Coates' distinction from his kind of characterization of what he calls white freedom and what he calls black freedom, and by black freedom I take him more to mean the history of kind of abolitionist liberation, which would entail slogans like no one's free unless we're all free, no one's free if another man is in chains, like that kind of idea, as opposed to what you could boil down a lot of white freedom slogans to mean, like freedom for me, subjugation for you, right? So those are two very, and clearly the white freedom version of that is, I can't give up. I can't, what your original quote was from Toni Morrison, saying I can't use my freedom to make you free because then I will lose whatever this thing I have. But the thing that you have is I mean, I'm not going to get into like whether it's real or false freedom, but it's it's morally rotten. Let's just put it that way. So I think, anyway, yeah, there's a lot in that, but I'll leave it there for the time being.
Yeah, but it's true. It's like they treat freedom as a zero-sum game or something, as a stake, that limited resource that they have to hoard whereas Toni Morrison is more like freedom. The more you share, the more freedom that we have.
I just want to say that, I do think, since we didn't touch on the climate chapter, but this is just kind of one segue about that, is that the reason why I say, like, I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of mileage to get with the Coates' distinction, but I think that what I try and get into in the chapter on climate, which has to do with kind of ecological ways of thinking about freedom, is that some of our political notions about freedom, like maybe most of them, developed over the past, say, 250 years, progressive, revolutionary, and reactionary, right-wing, all of them have not been thinking freedom with ecological limits in mind necessarily.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that in an ecological version of freedom, there are constraints. That's why the constraint is in part in the title. And that those constraints mean that, the most cogent way of putting it is like quoting Timothy Morton's phrase I quote in my climate chapter a couple of times, where he says, being nice to bunny rabbits means being not nice to bunny rabbit parasites. And that like the natural world is often a system of like trade-offs, and that there are decisions that we are trying to make at present about how to make the most form. I mean, we're not making it this way, but in my mind, what I'd like to see is how to like, on the one hand, how to make the most forms of life thrive, right? And retain biodiversity and retain a habitable climate. But it doesn't mean that there aren't decisions to be made or trade-offs and difficulties to those questions, and thinking ecologically in a systems fashion rather than a like seesaw of is really complicated because biosystems are so complicated. So anyway, that's all like another subject, but I just wanted to throw it out there.
Well, I wanted to actually, maybe we could squeeze two questions, because I had a couple climate questions too. Yeah, no, we're not thinking, we now have the, if you could call it, the limitations or the constraints of climate change. And when we think of our own freedoms or individual freedoms, when people think of individuals' freedoms, and this is not limited to just the white Western world, but also the global South, they think of growth, right? Like economic growth, growth in terms of their own net worth and so forth. But we can't think in that way anymore, which seems fair for the Western world. Seems less fair for places like India and Africa, who still rely on, fossil fuels in order to get by, whereas we can use, electric cars and so forth. But this is like more of a selfish question, because I'm always at a loss for this too. Like, I have students who express despair at having no future. They question even the point of writing poetry or even going to college because of global warming and all of its catastrophic repercussions. And often I'm really at a loss how to offer them wisdom without sounding stupidly optimistic or, or like a cheerleader or some sort. Like, how would you respond?
I know. It's all good. It's like that. Yeah. I mean, I think that I had to write the whole climate chapter to answer that question, because that chapter is a kind of staging of my going through, what Morton would kind of describe as these like stages of, dark ecology, like attended by grief and panic and a bunch of things. So I think that like, some of that has to be born, and that some of the reason why like optimism or hope or just encouragement or support can seem fake, or is that like we haven't reckoned, like and I think all I can say is that like after doing that kind of reckoning, I feel more pessimistic about the climate, but I feel more committed and alive to our moment, and I was, a lot of you guys probably know Joanna Macy, who's termed this moment the Great Turning, and there are other people who've given it other names, but basically trying to kind of indicate that it's not the moment that we realize that we're destroying the world, it's the moment at which we wake up to the fact that we need a new relationship to it, and I think that, it's not to say that, and I guess just like this idea of like no future, like all kids feel it all. I mean, it's like, but I think when you have adults echoing it instead of echoing a kind of sense of recommitment, and responsibility, it just makes it so much worse, to be like, well, we really messed it up and now it's for you guys to fix. Like, I just think that is not, I think, again, it's kind of a phobic core reaction. Like, I can't do anything about it. I feel impotent and panicked. So I'm just going to kind of slough off whatever, even though I'm at like, maybe like you and I are probably at like, hopefully, Allah willing, like at the height of our, midlife, like having, like some of the most privilege or capacity to be of use. And yet so many people are like throwing up their hands onto like younger generation at precisely that moment. I think it's crazy. And I also just think that like, there's going to be a lot of, this was another question that you and I talking about, which I wanted to talk about because of your book and Minor Feelings, and this question of feeling and its relationship to action, and like you could Google what 10 things should I do tomorrow to combat, climate change and to decarbonize. Like that would be like, there are many things you could find like that, but I feel like, we all have to bring what we have to bring. And I felt like what I had to bring at this moment was something about mood, which I'm not saying replaces decarbonization in the least. I'm just saying that the work of like weathering extreme weather events, offering each other solidarity and care and support, trying to be of help to ourselves and our loved ones and to people who we don't know yet who will become climate refugees. Like all of that requires a mood of fortitude, and not a mood that is only about anxiety and panic, which are two feelings I will just say I know really, really well. So I'm talking, this is when the, like, we were joking the other day, the Eve Sedgwick quote about the most paranoid tending people develop the richest reparative practices comes up. Like, I'm not insensible to falling into the whirlpool of those states at all. I don't think anyone, even most climate scientists, are. So somehow doing work where we can, recommit with each other seems to me really important,
I completely agree with that. And going back to, what you're saying about needing to, about not just doing like just looking up a list of actions, like climate change in one section of your book on climate change, you talk about how knowledge there's one thing to know climate change is happening. It's another thing to believe that climate change is happening. And for that belief to happen is that it has to kind of pierce your consciousness in some way. And that piercing, I think, can only happen through kind of the sensibility of knowing that your anxiety that you're denying is shared in some way. And that sharing can somehow then transform to action, and that then can transform to action. And, because which is what I was trying to do with Minor Feelings too, which is like, okay, I could tell you what you can do to better racism, but I think of what needs to first happen is to understand how this can pierce your consciousness in some way, which you do beautifully in the last essay. Are we out? Can I ask one more question, or is this? Yes. Okay. This is the final question. I wish we could go longer because I feel like we're finally warming up. What is the most pressing question from your book that remains unresolved or that you are still wrestling with, and what makes it difficult to resolve?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer. I mean, I will say that, like, you know, I hate to admit this because it sounds really like kindergarten-y, but like I feel like I've realized by now that I do tend to think in keywords, you know, and like for a while I was thinking about cruelty, and now, you know, I've been thinking about freedom or care, and I would say that like each book kind of produces a new keyword, and as I, you know, finished this book, that word was really time, you know, and thinking about mostly vis-a-vis the climate stuff, but also just the human capacity to, I mean, I think I'm more generous towards humans than some people are, and that I really do feel like some of the scale of the problems that we're facing have to do with, like I said, kind of having burned up a lot of deep time in no time. And by deep time, I mean like we burned fossil fuels up that took millions of years to accrue kind of in no time. And I feel like we can't really understand what we've done, but I feel like somewhere, you know, it's kind of like the body keeps the score, like somewhere we know what we've done, like somehow we know, we feel something we've done about time. And I think I'm really interested in, you know, just in what, you know, as I may be like moving towards like the second half or like the downhill slope of my life and like looking at diminishing time, I'm just interested. I'm interested in theories of time. I'm interested. It relates to what Cathy's saying about like raising young children, like time being an illusion, but you're watching them rocket forth in time, you know, anyway. So I'll just keep thinking about it, you know.
Okay. That will be, I think that's the last question of the evening. I wish.
On the downhill slope.
Yeah, downhill.
a downhill slope.
As we all grow old.
I just want to say one thing, Cathy. Can I say one thing?
Mm-hmm.
Just because of what you were talking about the part about being pierced, you know, and you were talking about your book. I just wanted to say that, like, because we're in this totally alienated forum, we have no idea who's here. Cathy and I just see each other in boxes. I wrote this book alone in a room, sometimes with the windows taped shut for wildfire smoke. There's been so much like isolation, you know, and that part of the climate chapter where I'm saying, and like you just said, Cathy, that part of the only thing that can in some ways attend to that anxiety and knock us into different states is like finding solidarity or communally shared forms of like hearing each other, you know. And I think like doing a book like this for 5 years and then only being able to talk like this about it, you know, in some ways it's really painful because it doesn't provide that sense of like communal sharing. But in the spirit of like, you know, what if what you have is what you need? I just want to say that like Cathy's book did that to me, exactly what you described, Cathy, and for so many others. And talking to you, Cathy, makes me feel less alone, you know. And so even if we feel like we can't see everybody here, I hope people feel less alone as well.
Thank you for that, Maggie. I'm going to cry. And I think that I also feel that about On Freedom. It has, I felt like I felt nurtured by it. And I hope that the audience will or are already feeling nurtured by On Freedom. Thank you all for coming. We are ending the program, and buy On Freedom, read On Freedom, and thank you so much, Maggie, for this conversation. I hope we'll be able to continue this conversation where IRL, we're actually in person.
IRL, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.